Hey there, tonight we're not talking about the gods everyone remembers, the thunderous ones, the famous ones, the ones carved into statues and spoken in loud epic poems. Tonight we're resting beside a quieter myth, a story about a god whose power lived not in lightning, oceans, or war, but in balance, boundaries, and the calm between chaos and harmony. If these slow, ancient stories give you even a small moment of peace, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a soft comment. Maybe just a gentle note about where you're listening from, or what time it is in your quiet corner of the world. No rush, no pressure, just calm connection. Now, settle into the softness around you, breathe slowly, and let your thoughts drift as we step back into the marble halls of Olympus, where one god faded from memory, and the world quietly learned the shape of his silence. In the shadowed cradle of eternity, where the winds of fate whisper through marble veins, a single name faded into nothingness. Not with a roar of thunder or the clash of divine arms, but with the quiet precision of a thread severed in the loom of existence. The gods watched, their immortal eyes unblinking, as the erasure began not in violence, but in the slow unravelling of memory itself. And in that moment the balance tilted, ever so slightly, like a scale burdened by an unseen weight. Olympus rose then as it always had, a pinnacle of gleaming stone, an endless sky, where the air hummed with the subtle harmony of divine order. The gods moved through its halls like figures in a timeless frieze, their footsteps echoing in rhythms that mirrored the pulse of the world below. Zeus, the thunderer, sat upon his throne, his gaze sweeping over the assembly with the authority of storms yet to break. Hera, regal and unyielding, arranged the peacock feathers of her robe, each plume a symbol of watchful vigilance. Poseidon stirred the waters in his chalice, sending ripples that foretold the tides of distant seas. Athena paced with measured steps, her owl perched silently, eyes piercing the veil of wisdom. Amid them walked the one they would come to forget, the god whose presence wove the fabric of equilibrium. He was not the mightiest, nor the most revered in mortal tales, but his duty was the silent guardian of all. Let us call him Elandor, for though his true name was struck from the annals, a shadow of it lingers in the echoes of forgotten winds. Elandor, the keeper of bounds, the enforcer of the unseen laws that held chaos at bay. His form was unassuming tall and slender, but cloaked in robes the colour of twilight mist, his eyes deep pools reflecting the ordered stars. He carried no weapon, no sceptre of power, only a simple staff of olive wood, etched with runes that pulsed faintly, aligning the discordant notes of creation. Each dawn, as Helios drew his chariot across the heavens, Elandor began his ritual. He traversed the outer edges of Olympus, where the mountain met the void, his staff tapping gently against the ethereal barriers. With each touch, he reinforced the divides between sky and earth, between god and mortal, between fury and calm. The gods scarcely noticed him, for his work was the air they breathed. Essential, yet invisible, Zeus might hurl a bolt to quell a rebellion. But it was Elandor who ensured the lightning struck, only where fate allowed, sparing the innocent threads of destiny. Hera's jealousies burned bright, but Elandor's quiet interventions tempered them, but preventing the unravelling of familial bonds that could shatter the divine court. In the gardens of Ambrosia, Where nymphs tended blooms that never wilted, Elandor paused to align the growth. His fingers brushed a petal, and the flower's colours deepened, its essence balancing sweetness with subtle bitterness, a reminder that excess in any form bred discord. The nymphs bowed subtly, their laughter a melody in perfect harmony, unaware that without his touch their voices might sour into cacophony. From there he moved to the forges of Hephaestus, where the clang of hammer on anvil rang like the heartbeat of invention. Elandor stood in the shadows, his staff humming as he calibrated the flames, ensuring the gods' creations held strength without fragility, innovation without destruction. As the day waned, Elandor ascended to the high council chamber, a vast dome open to the stars. Here, the gods gathered not in crisis, but in the routine of eternity. Apollo strummed his lyre, notes floating like golden threads, weaving prophecies into the air. Artemis roamed the periphery, her arrows quiescent in their quiver, her hunt restrained by the invisible leash of order. Dionysus poured wine that sparkled with restrained ecstasy, its potency checked by Elandor's unseen hand, lest revelry tip into madness. And in the centre, Zeus presided, his voice a rumble that commanded without question. But on this day, a day like any other, yet heavy with the weight of impending silence, the assembly turned its gaze upon Elandor. It began with murmurs, soft as the rustle of leaves in a forbidden grove. Ares, ever the steerer of strife, leaned forward, his armour creaking like distant thunder. Why do we tolerate this shadow among us? He growled, his eyes flashing with the fire of unchecked ambition. He binds us, limits our will. What is a god if not free to wield power without restraint? Hera nodded, her lips curving in a smile that held no warmth. He enforces duties we no longer need. Olympus stands eternal. His order is a chain from a bygone age. Poseidon shifted, the waters in his chalice swirling uneasily. The seas obey me, he rumbled. Why should I bow to his invisible laws? Even Athena, wise and measured, furrowed her brow. Balance serves, but perhaps we have outgrown it. Fate evolves, so must we. Zeus listened, his fingers drumming on the arm of his throne, each tap sending faint vibrations through the mountain. Elandor stood silent, his staff still, his expression unchanging. He had witnessed such whispers before, ripples in the divine pool, but never had they coalesced into a wave. The gods, in their immortality, had grown restless. Power, unchecked by mortality, bred a hunger for more. Elandor's role, once revered as the pillar of stability, now seemed a hindrance to their boundless desires. As the stars wheeled overhead, the council deepened. Apollo's lyre fell silent, its strings vibrating with unspoken tension. If we erase him, Apollo mused, his voice melodic yet grave, what silence follows? His absence might echo louder than his presence. But Ares dismissed it with a wave. Silence. We will fill it with glory unbound. The debate flowed like a river nearing a fall, slow at first, but gathering inexorable momentum. Elandor spoke then, his voice a calm thread in the tapestry. Order is not a chain, but the root that sustains the tree. Sever it, and the branches wither. But his words, once heeded as law, now dissolved into the air, unacknowledged. The gods averted their eyes, as if his very utterance offended their evolving pride. Zeus rose, his form towering, the air crackling with ozone. "It is decided," he intoned, his voice the finality of thunder. "Why erase him? Not in death, for gods do not die, but in oblivion." His name, his temples, his worship struck from the weave of reality. The assembly nodded. A collective breath released, as if shedding a long, carried burden. Elandor bowed his head, his staff dimming for the first time. He turned, his footsteps fading as he walked toward the edge of Olympus. The ritual of erasure would begin at dawn, a ceremony of unmaking, where divine will unravel what it had once forged. As he departed the chamber, a faint chill settled over the halls, a precursor, unnoticed, to the silence that would soon engulf all. Yet in that quiet withdrawal, the first thread pulled loose. Far below, on the mortal plains, a shepherd paused, his flock scattering without cause. A river bent its course slightly, eroding a bank it had long respected. The stars above flickered, their patterns shifting by a hair's breadth. The gods, in their council, felt nothing. But the world remembered even as memory began to fade. And in the deepening twilight, the inevitable loomed, a void where order once stood, waiting to swallow the harmony it had preserved. Dawn arrived without fanfare, a pale gold thread drawn across the edge of the world. Helios rose in silence, his chariot wheels turning slower than memory recalled, as though the sun itself hesitated to witness what was to come. On the highest terrace of Olympus, where the clouds parted like curtains of mist, the gods assembled in a circle vast and solemn. No banners flew, no hymns were sung. Only the wind moved, carrying the faint scent of olive wood about to burn. Elandor stood at the centre, alone. His twilight robes hung still, untouched by the breeze that stirred the garments of every other deity. The staff rested in his hand, its runes no longer glowing, but dulled to the colour of ash. He did not plead. He did not protest. He simply waited, as he had waited through countless dawns, performing the ritual that now would be performed upon him. Zeus stepped forward first, his presence a pressure against the air. In his right hand he held no thunderbolt, but a length of golden thread spun from the fates themselves, borrowed for this single purpose. One by one, the others approached. Hera laid her palm upon the thread, her touch cool and deliberate. Poseidon followed, salt water beading on his fingers as he pressed them to the strand. Athena came last among the greater gods, her fingers lingering a fraction longer, as if wisdom itself searched for an alternative that did not exist. When all had touched the thread, Zeus began to speak, not in words that echoed across the heavens, but in a low murmur that only the circle could hear. The language was older than names, older than mountains, the tongue used when the Titans were bound and chaos first given shape. With each syllable, the thread tightened around Elandor's form, not binding his body, but winding through the essence that held his identity together. Where it touched, memory thinned. Where it coiled, presence faded. Elandor's eyes remained open. He watched as the gods' faces grew distant, not in space, but in recognition. Ares looked through him as though he were mist. Apollo's gaze slid past, searching for a melody that no longer had a source. Even Hermes, ever restless, paused only briefly before turning away. a flicker of unease quickly buried beneath divine certainty. The thread completed its spiral. Zeus drew it taut, then released it. The golden strand dissolved into motes of light that drifted upward and vanished among the stars. In that instant, Elander's name left every mind that had ever known it. Not erased by force, but gently lifted, like a feather removed from a scale. His temples on earth, small, unadorned structures of white stone tucked in quiet groves, shimmered once, then settled into the landscape, as if they had always been ruins without purpose. The priests who tended them woke that morning with an unexplained emptiness, a sense that a daily rite had been forgotten, though they could not say which. On Olympus, the circle broke. The gods dispersed without ceremony, returning to their halls and gardens, as though a minor matter had been concluded. Laughter rose soon after, Dionysus pouring wine, nymphs dancing, the clang of Hephaestus's hammer resuming its ancient rhythm. Yet beneath the sounds, something had changed. The echoes in the marble corridors arrived a fraction late. The ambrosia tasted sharper, almost metallic. No one remarked upon it. To remark would be to remember what had been removed. Far below, in the mortal world, the first quiet consequences began to stir. In a village nestled against a hillside, an old woman who had prayed each evening to the nameless guardian of boundaries found her altar bare. She had always left a small bowl of barley and a sprig of olive at dusk. This night, her hands moved through the familiar motions, but the bowl remained empty, the sprig unplucked. She sat in the dim light of her hearth, staring at the vacant space, a faint ache settling behind her eyes. She slept uneasily, dreaming of walls that dissolved when touched. Across the sea, a merchant ship sailed under clear skies. The captain, accustomed to offering a silent nod toward the unseen keeper of safe passage, felt the deck shift oddly beneath his feet. The wind, steady moments before, veered without warning. Sails luffed, then filled again, but the course had altered by degrees. No storm threatened, no reef lay ahead, yet the helmsman gripped the tiller tighter, sensing an absence where guidance once lingered. In the wild places, animals paused. A stag at the edge of a clearing lifted its head, ears swivelling toward nothing. Wolves in a northern forest ceased their howl mid-note, throats closing on a silence they could not name. Rivers, long accustomed to following their carved beds, pressed a little harder against their banks, testing, as though the invisible hand that had shaped their patience was no longer there. On Olympus, night fell. The gods gathered in the great hall for feasting. Torches burned brighter than usual, as if to compensate for a dimness no one acknowledged. Conversation flowed, tales of mortal heroes, plans for new temples, rivalries sharpened into jest. Yet pauses lengthened between words. A lyre string snapped under Apollo's fingers, though he had tuned it moments before. Wine spilled from Dionysus's cup, staining the table like dark blood, though his hand had not trembled. Zeus sat at the head, his gaze sweeping the assembly. For an instant, his brow creased. A space at the edge of vision seemed emptier than it should be. He blinked, and the sensation passed. He raised his goblet, voice booming with forced heartiness. The gods responded, laughter rising again, louder this time. as though volume alone could fill what had been quietly taken away. High above, where the peaks pierced the starfield, a single olive staff lay against a pillar. No hand had placed it there. No eye noticed it now. Its wood had begun to pale, the etched runes fading to mere scratches. A faint wind stirred it, rolling it gently across the stone until it came to rest at the very brink of the terrace, overlooking the mortal world below. There it remained, balanced on the edge, neither falling nor secure. And in the vast quiet that followed the erasure, the world turned onward. Mortals slept, gods feasted, stars wheeled in their courses. But the silence left behind had begun to spread, not as absence, but as presence. A weightless pressure, like breath held too long. An expectation without form. The scales had been adjusted by divine will, and now the slow, inexorable tilt toward imbalance had begun. No one yet understood what had been lost. But everything, everywhere, had already started to feel it. The days that followed the erasure passed, like breaths held beneath still water. Olympus gleamed as brightly as ever, its pillars catching the light of a sun that rose and set with mechanical precision. The gods moved through their eternal routines, yet each motion carried a faint delay, as though the air itself had thickened. No one spoke of the ceremony on the terrace. No one needed to. The absence had been rendered perfect. In the gardens, the ambrosia blooms opened wider than before, their petals unfurling with a hunger that bordered on excess. Nymphs plucked them in greater handfuls, pressing the nectar to their lips more often, chasing a sweetness that seemed to fade the moment it touched the tongue. Laughter rang out, bright and sharp, but it ended abruptly, leaving echoes that lingered too long in the groves. Dionysus wandered among them, filling cups that emptied faster than memory allowed. He poured again and again, brow creasing each time the level dropped without a sip being taken. Hephaestus returned to his forge beneath the mountain. The fires burned hotter, the anvil rang louder, yet the metal resisted his will. A blade, meant to hold an edge, dulled after a single pass of the whetstone. A shield intended to turn aside any blow dented beneath a gentle tap. He worked longer hours, sweat beading on his brow, hammering with increasing force until the clang became a roar that shook dust from the cavern roof. Still, the creations emerged flawed, strong in one aspect, brittle in another, as though the balance between resilience and flexibility had slipped from his grasp. On the mortal planes, the quiet unravelling continued its slow advance. Villages that had known generations of measured harvests found their fields yielding unevenly. One plot burst with grain so heavy it bowed the stalks to breaking. The neighbouring field withered under the same sun, leaves curling like parchment. Farmers stood at the boundaries, staring across fences that no longer seemed to mark meaningful divides. Arguments arose over borders that had been settled since grandfather's times. Small disputes at first, voices raised in confusion rather than anger. Hands reached for tools that suddenly felt heavier. Rivers, once content to follow their ancient courses, began to wander. A gentle stream in a northern valley widened overnight, swallowing a footpath used by shepherds for centuries. No rain had fallen, no dam had broken. The water simply spread, patient and relentless, erasing footprints as though they had never been. In the south, a mighty river shrank in its bed, exposing rocks that gleamed like bones. Fish thrashed in shrinking pools, their silver bodies flashing in protest before the current reclaimed them, or failed to. Cities felt it too, though they could not name it. In the marketplaces of a coastal polis, merchants haggled with growing fervour. Words sharpened. Gestures grew wide. A disagreement over the weight of olives escalated until clay jars shattered on the stones, their contents staining the ground like spilled blood. Guards stepped in, but their intervention only spread the unrest. By dusk, the market lay quiet, strewn with broken pottery and bruised fruit, the air thick with the scent of waste. Traders packed their stalls early, glancing over shoulders at shadows that seemed deeper than usual. At night, mortals slept fitfully. Dreams came vivid and disjointed, images of walls dissolving, of paths leading nowhere, of voices calling names that dissolved before they could be answered. Children woke crying, unable to explain the emptiness pressing against their chests. Elders sat by dying hearths, staring into embers that refused to hold their shape. Remembering rituals they could no longer recall performing. High on Olympus, Ares grew restless. He paced the training grounds, spear in hand, challenging any who passed to spar. The younger gods obliged at first, their clashes ringing across the peaks. But the bouts lengthened, blows landing harder than intended. Armour cracked. Blood, divine and slow to heal, beaded on immortal skin. Ares laughed at first, delighting in the rawness. But even his mirth soared, when a wound refused to close as swiftly as it should. He hurled his spear into the sky, watching it arc and fall with unusual slowness, embedding itself deeper into the stone than physics allowed. Hera walked the halls of her palace, arranging and rearranging the peacock feathers in her crown. Each plume she adjusted seemed less vibrant than the last. She summoned attendants, demanding new dyes, rarer birds, brighter displays. The nymphs obeyed, but their movements dragged, their eyes distant. One dropped a mirror of polished bronze. It did not shatter, yet the reflection within warped, showing Hera's face fractured along invisible lines. She dismissed the girl with a sharp gesture, then stood alone, staring at the distorted image until she turned away. Zeus climbed to the highest pinnacle, where the throne of clouds overlooked all creation. He sat in silence, hand resting on the arm that once crackled with ready lightning. Below, storms gathered without his summons, dark masses swirling over mortal lands, rains falling in torrents one moment, ceasing abruptly the next. Thunder rolled, but it lacked direction, booming aimlessly across empty skies. He raised his hand to guide it, as he had done countless times. Yet the bolts hesitated, flickering like candles in wind before dissipating. For the first time, the king of gods felt the faintest tremor of uncertainty, a whisper asking whether his power still answered as it once had. Athena sought solace in her library, scrolls unrolled across marble tables. She read of ancient wars, of strategies that had turned the tide of fate, searching for patterns in the growing discord below. Her owl perched nearby, head tilting at angles sharper than usual. Pages turned beneath her fingers, but the words blurred. A treatise on justice seemed to contradict itself from one line to the next. She closed the scroll, pressing fingers to her temples, sensing an imbalance she could diagnose but not cure. Apollo ceased playing his lyre. The strings, though newly strung, produced notes that drifted out of tune moments after being struck. He walked the slopes where laurel grew, plucking leaves that crumbled to dust in his palm. Prophecies once clear in his mind, now arrived fragmented, visions of floods without cause, of cities burning under clear skies, of boundaries erased between ally and enemy. He spoke none of them aloud. To speak would be to give them weight. Time passed, weeks, perhaps months. Immortality blurs such measures. The changes deepened, no longer subtle. On earth, borders between kingdoms shifted in the minds of rulers. Old treaties were questioned, maps redrawn. Armies marched not in conquest, but in confusion, seeking to reclaim lines that had vanished from collective memory. Blood flowed where diplomacy once sufficed, and through it all, the olive staff remained on the terrace edge. Wind pushed at it gently, persistently. It rolled a finger's breadth closer to the drop, then stopped. Dust gathered along its length. The wood paled further, but veins of grey threading through the grain. No hand retrieved it. No eye noticed its slow advance toward the abyss. The silence left by the forgotten god had ceased to be mere absence. It had become a presence, patient, inexorable, spreading like frost across glass. The world turned, but its turning grew uneven. The scales, once held steady by an unseen hand, now tilted further with each passing dawn. And deeper still, in places no god yet looked, something began to listen to the silence, waiting for the moment when the void would be large enough to fill. The seasons turned, though no one on Olympus marked their passing with the old precision. Summer lingered too long in some lands, bleeding into harvests that rotted on the stalk. Winter arrived early in others, frost tracing patterns across windows before the leaves had fully fallen. Mortals adapted as mortals do, building higher walls, digging deeper wells, sharpening blades against threats that had no clear shape. Yet each adjustment only deepened the tilt. The world was learning to live within balance, and in learning, it grew accustomed to excess. On the mountain of the gods, the cracks began to show not in stone, but in temperament. Ares no longer sought sparring partners. He trained alone now, driving his spear into phantom enemies until the shafts splintered and the points blunted. His laughter had ceased entirely. In its place came a low growl that rumbled through the training grounds, like distant thunder that never quite broke. When younger deities passed, he stared through them, eyes burning with a fury that sought outlet and found none sufficient. Hera's palace grew quieter. The peacock feathers she had demanded in ever greater numbers now lay in heaps, their eyes dulled to lifeless grey. Attendants moved on silent feet, performing tasks with mechanical care, but the mirrors they polished reflected rooms that seemed larger, emptier. Hera herself spent long hours at her loom, weaving tapestries of familial harmony that unravelled the moment the shuttle passed. Threads snapped, patterns distorted. She would sit back, hands folded in her lap, staring at the chaos of colours until dusk claimed the light. Poseidon's moods swayed more violently than the seas he ruled. One dawn he would walk the shores of Olympus's cloud, bound oceans, trident trailing in the mist, calming waves that needed no calming. The next, he struck the surface without cause, sending geysers skyward that rained back as scalding vapour. His voice, when he spoke, carried an edge of bewilderment. The deep answers slowly now. He muttered to no one, watching currents twist against themselves. Fish schooled in frantic circles. Whales breached and fell with sounds like mourning. Athena withdrew further into her libraries. But the scrolls yielded less each time she unrolled them. Strategies that had once unfolded like perfect geometry now revealed flaws she could not reconcile. She paced the isles, all fluttering from perch to perch, its hoots sharp and questioning. At night, she stood on the balcony, gazing down at mortal cities where lights burned later and brighter, as if to ward off a darkness that came from within rather than without. Wars multiplied, small at first, then sprawling across borders that shifted like sand. Apollo's silence deepened. He abandoned his lyre in the laurel grove, strings slack and dust covered. The muses came to him less often, their songs faltering mid-phrase. When they persisted, he turned away, walking the high ridges until the wind scarred his skin. Prophecies arrived unbidden now. Flashes of burning fleets, of rivers running red, of temples crumbling under no siege but time itself. He pressed his palms to his eyes, but the visions lingered, etched behind the lids. Dionysus drank alone. The revels that once spilled across meadows in ecstatic torrents now gathered in shadowed corners. Small clusters of nymphs and satyrs huddled around dwindling fires. The wine turned bitter on the tongue, then sour, then thin as water. He poured libations to absent guests, calling names that dissolved before echo returned. Madness crept in at the edges, not the wild freedom of old, but a hollow frenzy that left participants weeping at dawn. Zeus felt the weight most keenly, though he admitted it to no one. Storms answered his call sluggishly, gathering only after long delay, dispersing before they crested. He summoned councils, but attendance thinned, but voices overlapped in discord. Decisions made one day were questioned the next. He climbed to his pinnacle throne more often, sitting for hours beneath stars that seemed farther away. Lightning played about his fingers when he clenched his fist, but the bolts fizzled against the clouds, leaving only the smell of ozone and a faint ache in his arm. Far below, the mortal world descended further into uneven rhythm. Cities that had thrived on measured trade now hoarded grain behind bolted gates. Roads once safe for travellers grew perilous, not from bandits alone, but from disputes over which path belonged to whom. A bridge spanning a narrow gorge collapsed without warning, stones tumbling into the rush below as though the river had finally claimed its due. Pilgrims bound for distant oracles found the paths overgrown, markers toppled, the words carved upon them weathered to illegibility. In wild places, the imbalance sharpened. Predators hunted without restraint, packs swelling until prey vanished and starvation followed. Herds trampled their own young in blind stampedes. Trees in ancient forests grew twisted, branches reaching in directions that defied the sun. Rivers carved new channels overnight, but swallowing villages that had stood for centuries. Survivors gathered on higher ground, telling stories of a time when the world held steady, though the details of that steadiness slipped from memory like water through fingers. And through all this slow fracture, the olive staff remained on the terrace brink. Wind had worn its surface smooth. The last traces of runes had vanished entirely. It lay balanced on the very lip now, one end extending over the void. A single strong gust would send it falling. But the winds that reached Olympus had grown erratic, gusting fiercely one moment, falling still the next. The staff waited, patient as the god who once carried it. Deep within the mountain, in chambers long unused, something stirred. Not chaos in its raw form, that had been bound since the Titan age, but a subtler hunger. The void left by Elandor's erasure had widened into a space where boundaries thinned, shadows pulled thicker in corners. Whispers rose from cracks in the stone, wordless yet insistent. The gods passed these halls without glancing within. Drawn by their own unravelling concerns, mortals began to dream the same dream. A figure in twilight robes, standing at the edge of a precipice, staff in hand, but gazing down upon the world. No face was visible, no words were spoken, yet the dreamer awoke with an ache of recognition, a sense that something essential had been lost and was not returning. Some rose in the night and walked to old, but forgotten altars, ruins they could not name, and left offerings of olive branches and barley. The gifts lay untouched by any hand, yet by morning they had withered to dust. The silence spread further. No longer merely absence, but a force that pressed against the edges of everything. It filled the pauses between heartbeats. It stretched the moments before sleep. It deepened the quiet after a storm that never quite arrived. And in that deepening hush, the world waited, not for restoration, but for the inevitable moment when the tilt would become a fall. Years folded into one another, the way river stones are smoothed by endless current. On Olympus, the golden light that once bathed every pillar now fell unevenly, brighter in some halls, dimmer in others, as though the sun itself had begun to favour certain corners and neglect the rest. The gods no longer gathered in the great council chamber. Doors that had stood open for eons were closed and barred from within. Footsteps echoed less often in the corridors, and when they did, they carried the weight of solitude. Zeus remained on his pinnacle throne longer, each day. He no longer summoned storms. The clouds below drifted without direction, piling into vast formations that cast shadows over mortal lands for weeks at a time. When lightning came, it struck blindly, splitting ancient oaks that had sheltered sacred groves, igniting forests that burned without consuming, leaving blackened trunks standing like accusations. Zeus watched these fires from above, his fingers motionless on the throne's arms. He felt the power still coiled within him, yet it answered as though through layers of wool, muffled and distant. Hera's loom had fallen silent. The tapestries she had begun lay half, finished across tables, threads tangled into knots, no patience could unravel. She walked the empty halls of her palace at night, trailing her fingers along walls that felt colder than memory, aloud. Peacocks roamed untended, their cries sharp and plaintive. feathers molting in clumps that gathered in corners like fallen snow. She paused sometimes before a tall mirror, searching her reflection for something she could not name, finding only eyes that looked back with quiet exhaustion. Poseidon rarely left the cloud oceans now. He sat on a jagged rock at the edge, trident planted beside him, staring into depths that no longer reflected his will. Currents clashed against one another, but forming whirlpools that spun for days before collapsing. Great waves rose unbidden, crashing against the ethereal shores of Olympus itself, sending spray hissing against marble that had never known moisture. Below, mortal seas mirrored the turmoil, ships vanished in calm waters, coasts eroded overnight. Islands shifted their outlines like dreaming beasts. Athena's library grew dusty. Scrolls lay scattered where she had left them mid, reading, edges curling. Her awl had ceased to fly. Perching motionless on a high shelf, eyes half closed. She stood often at the threshold of the chamber, one hand on the doorframe, unable to cross into the space that had once been her refuge. Wisdom felt thin now, stretched across too many fractures. She saw the patterns of collapse clearly, how each excess fed the next, how restraint had been traded for the illusion of greater freedom. But the knowledge brought no path forward, only the slow ache of inevitability. Az had abandoned the training grounds. His armour hung on a rack, gathering verdigris at the joints. He wandered the lower slopes where clouds met stone, spear dragging behind him, carving shallow grooves that filled with mist. Battles on earth called to him constantly now, clashes of armies over borders that existed only in fading memory, sieges laid against cities for reasons no chronicle recorded. He felt each death as a tug on his essence. Yet when he descended to taste the strife, the flavour was ash. Blood spilled without purpose left him hungrier than before. Apollo no longer walked the ridges. He sat in the laurel grove, back against a tree whose leaves had turned brittle and grey. The Muses had departed entirely, their footsteps fading into silence he could not follow. Oracles across the mortal world spoke in riddles that contradicted one another, voices cracking mid-prophecy. Plagues moved through cities without pattern, striking the strong, sparing the weak, vanishing as abruptly as they came. Apollo pressed his forehead to the rough bark, listening for a harmony that never returned. Dionysus's revels had shrunk to a single figure seated beneath a vine heavy with grapes that never ripened. He held an empty cup, turning it slowly in his hands. The madness he once gifted freely now claimed without permission. Mortals danced in streets until they collapsed, laughed until their throats bled, wept without cause in the midst of festivals. Vineyards across the world produced wine that turned to vinegar in the cask, or burned the throat like liquid fire. He stared at the barren vines, remembering a time when excess had been joy, not punishment. Far below, the mortal world bore the full weight of the tilt. Continents of strife had replaced scattered conflicts. Empires rose on foundations of sand, their banners flying over lands whose names changed with each new conqueror. Cities built walls higher and thicker, only to watch them crumble from within, stones shifting in the night, mortar dissolving like sugar in rain. Rivers no longer wandered, they raged, carving canyons where valleys had been, drowning plains that had fed generations. In the wilds, the imbalance reached its starkest form. Forests grew dense and impenetrable one season, then died back to skeletal trunks the next. Animals born with too many limbs, or none, all staggered briefly before the earth reclaimed them. The sky itself seemed to press lower, stars dimming behind veils of dust that no wind dispersed. Nights lengthened unnaturally, dawns arriving late and pale. Mortals had begun to speak of the silence, not as absence, but as a thing with presence. They described it in whispers around dying fires, a weight behind the eyes, a hush that followed every word, a feeling that something essential watched from just beyond sight. Some abandoned their homes, walking into wilderness, seeking the source of the quiet. Most never returned. Those who did spoke little, eyes wide with a knowledge they could not share. The old altars, those nameless ruins scattered across hills and hidden groves, drew pilgrims again. They came singly or in small groups, but carrying whatever offerings remained: withered olives, barley gone mouldy, cups of water drawn from tainted streams. They laid these gifts on cracked stones and waited. No sign came, no voice answered, yet they stayed, sitting in circles through the night, listening to a silence deeper than any they had known. And on the high terrace of Olympus, the olive staff finally moved. A wind, not fierce, but steady and deliberate, rose from the void below. It lifted dust from the stone, swirled it briefly, then pressed against the pale wood. The staff rolled once, twice, its balance lost. For a long moment it teetered on the edge, one end hanging over nothingness. Then it tipped forward, falling soundlessly into the abyss. It tumbled through clouds that parted without resistance, past storms that raged without direction, down toward the mortal world, turning slowly beneath. No eye marked its descent. No hand reached to stop it. The staff fell like a single thread, pulled from a vast, unravelling tapestry, unnoticed, yet carrying with it the weight of everything that had been severed. As it disappeared into the distance, the silence on Olympus deepened one final degree. The gods, scattered in their separate solitudes, felt a faint shift, like a breath released after long holding. They did not understand it. They did not gather to discuss it. Each simply paused, wherever they were, sensing that something had crossed an invisible threshold. Below, in a quiet grove where an ancient altar stood half, buried in ivy, the staff landed at last. It struck the earth softly, embedding itself upright beside the weathered stone. No thunder announced it. No light flared. Only a faint vibration travelled through the soil, felt by roots long dormant, by stones that had forgotten warmth. And in that moment, the silence paused as though listening for what might come next. The groves had multiplied in silence, linked by roots that threaded beneath the scarred earth like veins of quiet resolve. Where once a single staff stood, now dozens rose, slender shafts of olive wood, each crowned with leaves that caught the light in subtle silver. Around them, the nameless altars emerged from their burial of ivy and soil, stones shifting with soft sighs as though waking from long sleep. Pilgrims gathered in greater numbers, but drawn by dreams that grew clearer each night. The same twilight figure walking boundaries, staff tapping gently, restoring lines that held without constraining. In these circles, speech remained spare. Words were used only when necessary, to share bread, to point toward a new sprout, to name a child born beneath the spreading branches. Children grew swiftly here, their eyes old with unspoken knowing. They played without shouts, movements fluid and contained, as though the air itself taught restraint. At dusk, the communities sat facing the staffs, breathing slow and even, but feeling the hush transform from weight to cradle. The changes spread outward in measured waves. Rivers nearest the groves began to clarify, silt settling into patterns that echoed ancient beds. Fish returned in schools that moved with purpose rather than frenzy. Banks held firm where water pressed, yielding only where yielding served the greater flow. Fields beyond the circles yielded harvests, neither scant nor excessive. Grain heavy enough to bow the stalk, yet light enough to stand until hands came to gather. Farmers who ventured near felt the shift, paused at the edges, then carried the steadiness home in quiet steps. Cities felt it last, but feel it they did. Walls that had leaned outward halted their slow collapse. Markets reopened with voices lowered, bargains struck without the old edge of desperation. Armies encamped across contested fields found their fury cooling overnight. Swords were sheathed, fires banked. Sentries watching one another across distances that no longer seemed worth crossing. Leaders woke from dreams of solid walls and clear borders, issuing orders not for advance, but for withdrawal, to lines that felt, inexplicably, right. High on Olympus, the gods stirred from their isolations. Zeus left the corridors and climbed once more to his pinnacle. Clouds parted as he ascended, revealing stars that burned steadier than in uncounted years. He sat upon the throne, hand resting lightly on the arm, and felt the faintest response in the air, a tremor of power answering without delay. Lightning did not leap unbidden now. It waited, coiled and attentive. He exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the vastness, a yet carrying relief he had not known he sought. Hera returned to her palace. Peacocks lifted their heads as she passed, feathers beginning to gleam again at the tips. She entered the loom chamber, fingers brushing the tangled threads. One by one, a knot loosened under her touch. Colours separated, patterns emerging as though the weave remembered its intent. She sat and began again, not with force, but with patience, shuttle moving in rhythm that echoed a deeper pulse. Poseidon walked to the edge of his oceans. Water lapped gently at the rock, no longer sluggish, but alive with subtle motion. He raised his trident, not in command, but in question, and the tides answered, rising and falling in measures that matched the moon's ancient pull. Leviathans surfaced nearby, songs rising low and resonant, weaving through the mist. He listened, beard lifting in a faint smile that held no triumph, only recognition. Athena opened the library doors. Dust motes danced in shafts of light that found their way through high windows. Her owl stirred, wings stretching, eyes sharpening to gold. She gathered scattered scrolls, rolling them with care, placing them in order that felt intuitive once more. Wisdom returned not as remedy for all fracture, but as clarity amid what remained broken, enough to guide, not to force. Arrows rose from the hollow, He walked the grooves he had carved, water rippling aside as his boots passed. The notches in his blade caught the light. He carried it to the abandoned forge, laid it on the anvil, and waited. Sparks rose when he struck, clean, precise, metal yielding to shape rather than resisting. Strife below had not ended, but it sharpened into purpose. Battles with borders worth defending, causes that held meaning beyond chaos. Apollo stood beneath the laurel. New leaves unfurled overhead, green threaded with faint gold. He lifted his lyre from the ground, strings humming softly at his touch. A single note rose, clear, unbroken, a hanging in the air until birds answered from distant branches. Prophecies arrived whole again, not of endless silence, but of endurance through fracture, of harmony restored not by erasure, but by acceptance of limits. Dionysus righted his vine. Sap flowed beneath blackened bark, swelling buds that opened into clusters heavy with promise. He filled his cup from a spring that ran clear nearby, drinking slowly. The wine carried sweetness balanced by earth, neither cloying nor bitter. Revels began anew in mortal lands, but measured dances that ended before exhaustion, laughter that left room for quiet. The gods did not gather yet. No council was called. Each felt the shift alone, a private reckoning with what had been lost and what returned, not the same, but transformed. Power remained, but tempered now by memory of its cost. They moved through halls that echoed less hollowly, footsteps finding old rhythms, pauses shortening between action and response. Between Olympus and the groves, the connection strengthened, unseen but felt. Roots climbed higher through hidden fissures in the mountain's heart, to drawing from divine stone the essence that had scattered. The staffs below grew taller, branches intertwining into canopies that sheltered wider circles. Pilgrims looked up through leaves and saw, on clear nights, stars aligned in patterns long forgotten yet instantly familiar. The silence had not vanished. It lingered, softer now, a reminder rather than a weight. In its depths, the world breathed deeper. Excess receded not through force, but through the quiet return of bounds. Order emerged not as chain, but as root, holding without strangling, but guiding without commanding. And in the first grove, where the original staff stood strongest, a figure appeared at dusk. Not in blaze of light or crash of arrival, but simply there, tall and slender, cloaked in twilight mist, hand resting on the wood that had once been his. No face showed beneath the hood. No words broke the hush. He stood among the seated pilgrims, who felt only a deepening calm, a sense that the waiting had ended without fanfare. Above, the gods paused wherever they were, Zeus on his throne, Hera at her loom, Poseidon by the waves, and looked downward through parting clouds. They saw the groves glowing faintly, like embers banked against night. Recognition came slowly, not as regret, but as understanding. What they had erased had not been destroyed, only displaced, but carried by the world itself until the world was ready to return it. The figure in the grove lifted his head toward Olympus. No gesture of accusation, no demand for restoration, only acknowledgement, quiet, enduring, complete. And in that shared silence, the balance shifted once more, not to what had been, but to what could endure. The figure in the grove did not linger long beneath the stars. When dawn's first pale thread touched the canopy, he stepped away from the staff, his hand lifting slowly, as though releasing a breath held through ages. The pilgrims felt the shift, a subtle deepening of the calm, like water settling after a stone's quiet drop. No one rose. No one spoke. They simply watched the twilight robes fade into morning mist, leaving only the faint imprint of footsteps in the dew, soft earth. Above, on Olympus, the clouds parted fully for the first time in uncounted years. Light fell clear and even across marble halls, revealing dust long undisturbed, cracks long ignored, yet also the enduring strength of stone that had weathered worse. Zeus stood at the pinnacle's edge, gazing downward. The groves glowed softly across the mortal lands, small constellations of silver, green against the darker tapestry of the world. He felt no urge to descend, no need to command. Power had returned, but it carried now the memory of restraint. Hera finished her tapestry at midday. The weave depicted not perfect harmony, but harmony endured, threads of shadow woven alongside light, knots left visible as reminders rather than flaws. She hung it in the great hall, where sunlight through high windows caught the colours and cast them across empty benches. Peacocks gathered beneath, tails spreading in slow fans that caught the hues, reflecting them back softer, truer, but Poseidon walked into his oceans. Water closed around him without resistance, cool and alive. He swam deep, trident trailing, until leviathans encircled him in slow, solemn dance. Their songs rose around him, notes of loss acknowledged, of balance restored not to perfection but to sufficiency. He surfaced at dusk, water streaming from his beard, and stood on the rock watching mortal shores, where waves met sand in measured cadence. Athena opened every door in her library. Light and air moved through the aisles, stirring scrolls into gentle motion. Her owl soared once around the chamber, then settled on her shoulder, talons light. She walked the paths outside, that touching olive trunks that stood straighter now, branches heavy with fruit, neither scant nor burdensome. Wisdom had become not the imposition of order, but the quiet recognition of its necessity and its cost. Ares carried his reforged blade to the training grounds. He drove it once into the stone, not in rage, but in marking, the edge held clean. Below, mortal strife continued, but with borders worth the blood defences of hearths, protections of the vulnerable, conflicts that ended when purpose was served. He felt the tug of each clash, but it came measured now, enough to sharpen, not to consume. Apollo played his lyre beneath the laurel at twilight. Notes rose clear and intertwined, weaving through the groves below, where mortals paused to listen, without knowing why. Songs returned to temples, to fields, to quiet hearths, melodies that acknowledged sorrow, yet carried forward. Prophecies spoke now of cycles, fracture and mending, excess and restraint, erasure and slow return. Dionysus harvested the first ripe clusters. Juice ran deep red between his fingers, scent rich with earth and sun. He filled cups and passed them among the nymphs who had returned, their steps light but unhurried. Revels spread across mortal lands, dances that built to ecstasy and released before collapse. Wine that warmed without burning, laughter that left space for breath. The gods gathered at last, not in council, but in the great hall where Hera's tapestry hung. They came singly, at different hours, standing beneath the weave in silence. No words of apology were spoken. Divine pride allowed no such direct admission. Yet each lingered longer than needed, eyes tracing the shadowed threads. Zeus arrived last, standing at the centre. He looked at each in turn, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Ares, Apollo, Dionysus, and nodded once. They returned the gesture, subtle and unanimous. No throne was reclaimed in full authority. No decrees rebuilt the old order. They simply remained, scattered yet connected, power tempered by the long silence they had endured. Olympus stood not as before, but as it could now endure, brighter in places, shadowed in others, whole in its acceptance of both. Below, the figure walked the boundaries once more. Not on Olympus, but through mortal lands, staff in hand, robes brushing grass still bent from old storms. He paused at each grove, touching leaves that parted for him, reinforcing lines not with force but with presence. Rivers recognized his step and held their banks. Fields yielded in season. Cities rebuilt on foundations that acknowledged the earth's slow shift. Mortals saw him rarely, a glimpse at twilight, a shadow at the edge of vision. Those who did felt only calm the sense that someone kept watch, not to prevent all fracture, but to ensure that fracture did not become unraveling. Children grew knowing boundaries without being taught, paths that felt safe, walls that held when needed, silences that comforted rather than oppressed. The staffs remained rooted, branches spreading wider, canopies linking grove to grove until the mortal world carried a subtle lattice of silver, green beneath its skies. Pilgrims stayed or left as life called, carrying the quiet with them into cities, fields, homes. The silence left behind had transformed, no longer a void, but a space where meaning could settle. And so the world turned, not perfect, not unbound, but balanced in its enduring imperfection. Excess found its limit not through punishment, but through the patient memory of what unrestraint cost. Order held not as chain, but as root, deep, flexible, alive. On Olympus, the gods watched the slow wheeling of stars, feeling the faint tug of roots far below. They did not speak his name, they never would. Yet in quiet moments, each acknowledged the presence that walked the boundaries still, erased, once by divine will. Restored by the world's quiet refusal to forget what it needed. The figure paused at the edge of a final grove, staff planted in earth that welcomed it. He looked upward once, toward peaks veiled in distant cloud, then turned and continued his walk. Footsteps left no trace. The wind carried no announcement. Only the hush remained, deeper now, calmer, eternal. And in that hush, everything held. "Good night,"